Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Today, Intel launches Rocket Lake, the 11th generation of core CPUs first launched way back in 2008. So much has changed in the past 13 years, from SSD adoption to GPU advancements to monitor resolutions. Can Intel's new 11th gen CPU keep up with the best from AMD? Today, we're going to find out. Today's video is brought to you by us in support of YouTube Premium, which supports us. Premium removes ads from YouTube, allows background play on mobile devices, allows for easy downloads for offline watching, provides YouTube Music Premium, and more. More details after the video. Today's video is a direct comparison of the 6-core CPUs from AMD and Intel and is not intended to be a general Rocket Lake review. That will come shortly, however, since I did not have time to finish the i9-11900K testing, nor did I have time to test PCI Express 4.0 on the Z590 motherboard, so look for more videos soon on both topics. Having said that, a brief summary of the new features on Rocket Lake is worth including. First, PCI Express 4.0 support is included on the i5, i7, and i9 11th gen CPUs. It is not included on the Celeron, Pentium, and i3 11th gen, as those are actually Comet Lake refresh chips and do not benefit from any of the new Rocket Lake features. PCI Express 4.0 is only supported on Z590, Z490, and B560 motherboards, and only with 11th gen CPUs. The new 500 series boards also have USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 20 gigabit per second support and AX210 Wi-Fi 6E support, which allows for a mind-bending 3 gigabits per second wireless transfers. However, check your specific board because not all boards support the max speed. There is also a doubling of DMI bandwidth from 4 lanes to 8 lanes from the CPU to the chipset, providing a lot more bandwidth for NVMe drives and network connections. This is only true, however, on the Z590 boards with an 11th gen chip installed. B560 boards do not get the extra DMI lanes to the chipset. B560 boards also only have 12 chipset PCI lanes, whereas the Z590 board has 24. Finally, official support for DDR4 3200 is finally here. However, note that this comes more in the flavor of JEDEC timing support rather than the typical XMP high-speed support we're all used to. So you're still going to want to turn on XMP in your BIOS, even if you have DDR4 3200 RAM. Thunderbolt 4 support rounds out the new features, which is nice, but since I have yet to find a real use for Thunderbolt 3, I'm going to give that one a big, huge shrug and move on. The 6-core CPUs are the volume sellers for both AMD and Intel, with the Ryzen 5 3600 holding the #1 top spot for most of the past year on both Amazon and Newegg. At a retail price of $199, I'm fine with that because it's a solid value for the money. Those of you who have watched our weekly live streams already know how I feel about the $299 retail price of the Ryzen 5 5600X. It's just priced wrong in my opinion. Had it launched for $249 with a $199 non-X version, it would be a strong buy recommendation from me. However, for $300, I think you should get 8 cores in 2021. My opinion does not change when it comes to Intel. The $295 MSRP of the i5-11600K is also too high. However, both Amazon and Newegg are launching it for $269, which is a nice discount, and it puts it close to that $250 sweet spot that I'd like to see AMD at. It's worth noting, however, that at the time of filming, the Ryzen 5 5600X is out of stock at MSRP almost everywhere, so it may be a moot point if you can't find one. Having said all of that, there is a 6-core solution that I do think is a good deal. It's in stock at a reasonable price, provides great performance, and it won't require a mega cooler to keep temps under control. The i5 i5-11400 is launching for $184 on both Amazon and Newegg, an $86 savings over the i5-11600K launch price. Now you do lose overclocking, however that's not as big a deal as you might think. The i5-11400 comes with a 4.2 GHz all-core turbo out of the box, and it now supports overclocked XMP RAM on even the B560 motherboards, in addition to the Z590. That is 400 MHz slower than the 11600K, but in typical configurations on a mid-level PC, that's not going to make a difference, you'll notice, outside of maybe 1080p esports gaming. In addition to giving up overclocking, you also gain a stock cooler in the box, which is nice because it's free. However, I'd still replace it with something like a Deepcool GAMX 400 for $25 to provide a quieter and cooler running experience. What motherboard would I use? A B560 in the $100 price range would be my target. There are a few to pick from, however, they are fairly light on features. ASRock has a Z590 board for under $150 that is worth considering for either the 11600K or the 11400. Spending any more than that for an i5 system just makes no sense. Go to the i7 or higher if you're going to spend $200+ on a motherboard. Another option to consider, if you can find one, is a Ryzen 5 3600 for close to $150. I would consider that an equally good value to the i5-11400. Put the 3600 on a B550 motherboard in the $100 price range, and you have a sleeper powerhouse computer that will run all but the most demanding games. One more thought on coolers. If you do decide to buy the 5600X or an 11600K, I still think the Deepcool GAMX 400 is a solid deal, and I'd be comfortable putting it on either CPU. Neither CPU has any overclocking headroom to care about, and yes, I did try. With a Corsair H150i 360mm liquid cooler, I was able to hit 4.8 GHz on my i5-11600K before voltage levels rose above my comfort limit of 1.35 volts. That is a whopping 200 MHz over the stock 4.6 GHz all-core turbo mode, making overclocking dead and pointless in my opinion. The 5600X suffers from a similar fate. Today's CPUs were tested at stock clock speeds with only XMP enabled in the BIOS to enable the RAM to run at its rated speed. The test benches are similar with premium motherboards, premium cooling solutions, premium SSDs, and premium RAM kits. The exact same GPU was used on both test benches, a RTX 3080 for the Win 3 from EVGA, so boost clocks on the GPU should be the same. The footage you're about to see was recorded externally on a hardware capture card. The benchmarks and on-screen display were provided by MSI Afterburner. Multiple runs were used to ensure repeatable results, and these are clean test benches with nothing else running. Clean installs of Windows, clean updated drivers, basically perfection. Expect your own performance to be slightly slower on a real-world PC. Finally, we are testing only in 1440p for the first time ever in a CPU review. I can hear the collective why coming from all of you. First, we didn't used to test in 1080p for CPUs, we used to test in 720p. Before that, 800 by 600 was used, and that really wasn't all that long ago in human terms. Today, 2021 has brought 1440p monitors for under $200 and GPUs able to run at 1440p at very high frame rates. I consider 1440p the new 1080p, and if you're building a new PC in 2021, 1440p is the ideal target resolution, with 4K a close second. I'm sure many of you are still running at 1080p, and you may even be thinking of upgrading to these CPUs to continue playing at 1080p, and that's fine. You can certainly do so. Some of the tests here are still CPU limited, even at 1440p. Watch the GPU usage percentage. When it comes off of 99% and starts dropping, the CPUs are starting to become the limit to further performance, and more GPU power or a lower resolution would not produce more frames per second. Let me know your thoughts on this change in the comment section below. I imagine there will be at least one. Starting off with the game benchmarks first, we have Anno 1800. This game is more CPU intensive than some due to the huge world building that's possible and the number of things going on that must be tracked. Both CPUs provide awesome performance here, with the Ryzen 5 edging out the i5 by a small amount. It's worth noting, however, that both CPUs are bottlenecking the RTX 3080 at 1440p high detail in several places during this benchmark. Not all the time and not everywhere, but several times the CPU becomes the limit to further performance. This is not the last time you'll see this today. The 5600X wins this test at 192 frames per second average versus 181 on the 11600K, which is a nice margin of 9 frames per second. However, in real terms, this is a tie. Without numbers on the screen, you'd never notice 192 versus 181 or 138 versus 122 on the 1% low. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is next, and yes, I know, this is not Valhalla. We'll get to that. I'm including this because I'm still testing it as part of my GPU roundup, which is coming up very soon, and I already had half of the graphics cards tested when Valhalla launched last year, and I'm reluctant to throw away any work, so you're getting both games. Notice the CPU usage percentage on both chips goes well above 50%. It is worth remembering that every thread is counted as 8.33% of that total number, so 75% usage would be 9 threads fully used, 6 real cores, and 3 additional threads. Honestly, a 6-core CPU is the wrong choice for AAA games in 2021 if you have an RTX 3080 and are playing at 1440p. At 4K, the CPU usage would be lower as the frame rate drops because frame rate is what tends to drive CPU usage higher, assuming you have enough GPU power to keep up. This is a tie with the 11600K at 108 and the 5600X at 107. This is totally within the margin of error, and these numbers would swap 1 or 2 frames per second each way with multiple runs. The 1% low is slightly further apart, but it also tends to move a bit with multiple runs, so this truly is a very minor difference. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is next, and it is indeed more demanding to run than Odyssey. I've been considering a 3 or 4 year comparison of Assassin's Creed to see just how performance has changed over time. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a Syndicate to Origins to Odyssey to Valhalla comparison and on what CPU and GPU combo. We have a tie. 81 frames per second average on both CPUs and a statistical tie on the 1% low frame rate. I know this is the most exciting comparison ever, right? Well, hold on, we're going to see some other differences in future games. Borderlands 3 is next, and very quickly you're going to notice something. The CPU usage is fairly low on both chips, and the frame rates are almost exactly the same. As you might imagine, this is because we're GPU bound in this test. I can hear you already. Tech, this is why you should be testing at 1080p. 1440p is a GPU test, not a CPU one. I understand that thinking, but let me counter you this. Both CPUs are not only running over 100 frames per second average, they're over 100 frames per second average in the 1% low. Even if we saw a small difference at 1080p, you'd be looking at 200 versus 210 frames per second. And honestly, in Borderlands, does that actually matter? 127 average on the 11600K versus 130 on the 5600X. The 1% low is equally close. These are effectively same performance in this game at a resolution you're actually likely to play if you have an RTX 3080. F1 2020 is next, and it's included because A, we need a driving game, and B, because it really will run into the hundreds of frames per second if you give it enough CPU and enough GPU. Take a look at the 5600X, well over 300 frames per second and using all 6 real cores to do so. The 11600K is close, but it falls behind here slightly, dropping below 300 frames per second more often than the 5600X. Again, this is why I'm testing at 1440p. If we're getting 300 frames per second at 1440p, it would be rather silly to even bother with 1080p. Some people like theory testing, however, I am not one of them. I prefer to test in configurations that are at least reasonable. Now, of course, you may say that a 3080 is not reasonable for either of these CPUs, and actually, I'd agree with you. A 3060 Ti or a 3070 would make more sense. But I also need to be able to compare the i5, the i7, and the i9 together, and so using a 3080 is a compromise choice to keep me from having to endlessly repeat tests. 310 frames per second average on the 5600X versus 281 on the 11600K. That's a solid win for the 5600X, nearly 10% faster, which at these frame rates is impressive. Far Cry New Dawn is up next. The full-price DLC to Far Cry 5, a point I'm contractually obligated to say anytime I cover this game. The 5600X is faster here by a few frames per second, but overall we're more GPU bottlenecked than anything else. This brings up a point worth considering. If you have less than an RTX 3080 or an RX 6800 XT, then any differences in these tests will very quickly vanish. Put an RTX 2070 or an RX 5700 XT on both of these CPUs, and you'll be so completely GPU bound there may be no difference at all between either. The real point to buying a fancy new CPU is to pair it with a high-end GPU, have both of them feed off of each other to give you an amazing experience. 131 frames per second average on the 11600K versus 139 on the 5600X, similar on the 1% lows. The 5600X is faster by a hair. Ghost Recon Breakpoint, a game that is both one of my favorites from the past few years and one of the biggest disappointments. The follow-up to Ghost Recon Wildlands, a wonderful game from a few years ago that I finished and had a ton of fun playing. I have to admit I have not finished Breakpoint and probably never will. This isn't a game review, however, so looking at the numbers, both CPUs are very close. Both CPUs go over 50% multiple times, and having played this game for well over 100 hours, I can tell you it's perfectly playable on either CPU, or a Ryzen 5 3600 for that matter, but it is smoother on an 8-core machine. It doesn't matter most of the time, but when you get into a big battle, you'll really be grateful to have more cores. A 12-core Ryzen 9 5900X would not be wasted on this game. 183 average on the 5600X versus 175 on the 11600K. Another example that Intel didn't quite catch AMD with the new Rocket Lake design, but they did close the gap to within arm's throw of Zen 3. Horizon Zero Dawn, the highly optimized PC port of the classic PlayStation 4 game that came out 4 years ago. Wait, that's not right. Horizon Zero Dawn, the awful PC port of the classic PS4 game that should run like a dream on the PC, but it doesn't because reasons. There are parts of this benchmark that hit over 75% on these 6-core CPUs. That's deep into the hyperthreading, or SMT if you prefer AMD. Yes, it'll play, and yes, it'll run, and yes, it'll be fine. But heaven help you if you're multitasking or you dislike frame stutters during busy action scenes. This is another game that I think really deserves 8 cores. Not for more frames per second, because it won't be faster, but for better frame times and a nicer overall smooth experience. 137 frames per second average on the 5600X versus 130 on the 11600K. That's another statistical tie if I have ever seen one. Now the difference would be a little bit larger at 1080p, but less than you might think because you'd run out of GPU power to drive the frames much faster. The Division 2, perhaps my most played game out of the past 2 years outside of World of Warships, XCOM 2, City Skylines, and Cyberpunk 2077. Okay, so maybe it isn't my most played game, but goodness, it feels like it sometimes. This game eats cores for breakfast. I've tested it on a Ryzen 9 5950X 16-core 32-thread beast, and in combat, you can use 20 plus threads on that monster CPU. Now, you don't get higher average frame rates with all of those cores, but what you do get is a butter smooth frame time graph. This game is completely playable on a 4-core 8-thread CPU. However, you will suffer from input lag, movement lag, and hitches during combat. More cores equals a nicer experience. Finally, we have Watch Dogs Legion, a new game that does not seem to get the attention of Cyberpunk, but it's equally hard to run. I'm testing it here in place of Cyberpunk because it has a repeatable built-in benchmark which provides more accurate comparisons between CPUs and GPUs. Live gameplay can be very tricky to fairly compare on a repeatable level. This time, the 11600K wins with a 116 average versus the 5600X at 113. However, this is also a tie and within the margin of error, so while it's a win, it's a pretty meaningless one. Game benchmarks are nice, but this wouldn't be a CPU comparison without a few non-gaming tests to see what you could expect in Windows. Now, I typically don't do extensive non-gaming tests for two reasons. First, I think most of you are gamers and primarily interested in new hardware for gaming. I get very few questions about 3D animation, video editing, virtual machines, and servers, so I don't think that's what you're all really interested in. Now, if I'm wrong, let me know in the comment section down below. Also, to be fair, those areas are not my expertise, at least not currently. I used to manage Windows servers for a living, starting back with Windows NT 4.0 in the 90s and finishing with 2003 R2 in the early 2000s. But that is long in the past. I have not personally touched a Windows server in more than 10 years. Second, general CPU performance has been good enough for most people in Windows for a long time now. A first-gen i7-920 from 2008 may not be epic today, but if you're simply browsing the tweetbook, checking Snapgram, or watching videos on OnlyTalk, it's plenty. A used i5-6400 will beat even that in general Windows use, and those can be found fairly cheap on eBay these days. So who really needs a brand new $300 CPU for general Windows use? 7-Zip is a wonderful file compression and decompression utility, free to use and fast, using modern CPUs effectively. The Ryzen 5 5600X is simply faster here versus the 11600K. It's faster in compression, decompression, and wins by enough that if you do this sort of work all day, well, why don't you have a Ryzen 9? You laugh, but if you honestly need compression performance, more cores makes for a faster result. CPU-Z is next, and it has a quick benchmark built in that is easy for you to compare your own system to the ones shown here. It's also great for checking your motherboard BIOS version, RAM speed, and more. This time we have a split result. The 11600K has a higher single core speed at 660 versus the 636 on the 5600X. This is partly why Intel claims the new crown in performance. Its single core performance is second to none, in general. However, notice the 5600X still wins in multi-threaded performance, if only just. Part of that is the larger on-chip cache, part of it is the higher all-core turbo speed, and part of it is just Ryzen being awesome at multi-threaded workloads. CineBench R20 is another free benchmark you can test your system with very quickly. This time, the 5600X wins both tests, but not by enough to make any real difference. It's also worth noting the RAM speed isn't the same between the two machines, so in that respect, it's not 100% evenly matched. I do not, however, feel that is enough of a factor to really matter, or I'd change that on the test bench. Finally, we have Blender, a 3D animation tool that has a lovely benchmark that runs 6 different scenes to provide a real workload and an honest real-world comparison. The i5-11600K finished all 6 scenes in 52 minutes and 55 seconds. The Ryzen 5 5600X finished in 51 minutes and 51 seconds. So the 5600X is faster and it clearly wins, right? Yeah, I guess so. But is a 1-minute render performance difference over 52 minutes of rendering time a performance gap that matters? Are you sitting there in front of your computer for 52 minutes watching your computer render? To give you an idea of how silly this test is on a 6-core CPU, the Ryzen 9 5900X does this same test in under 27 minutes. If you actually care about Blender rendering times, why are you looking at 6-core CPUs in 2021? For that matter, if you're making money doing Blender work, can I interest you in a 64-core Threadripper? If time is money, a $4,000 CPU is actually pretty cheap in the time it'll save you over the course of a year or two of professional Blender use. Thank you everyone for watching that whole set of benchmarks. 2 gold stars to all of you. At the end of the day, these 2 CPUs are different sides of the same coin. Are you an AMD fan or an Intel fan? Great, pick one and be happy the differences are minor and trivial in terms of these CPUs. Well, actually, in fairness, the AMD chip has one really huge thing going for it. If you really want a Ryzen 9 5900X or 5950X, but either can't find one in stock right now or simply cannot afford one today, but you would like to upgrade in the future, that's an option. I do, however, advise you buy a nicer motherboard if that's the goal. Spend $200 instead of $100 on your board to give you room to upgrade to that Ryzen 9. However, that's not an option for the 11600K. There is no real upgrade choice. Yes, the 8-core i7 and i9 exist, but that's just silly. Upgrading on the same generation and the same per-core performance from 6 cores to 8 cores is a waste of your time. If you are going from 6 to 8 cores, it should also be a generational upgrade, not just more cores. So for example, Zen Plus to Zen 3, or perhaps Haswell to Rocket Lake. Those are huge per-core performance jumps and not just more of them. So upgrade options? No upgrade options. You decide. Overall, this is not a very exciting launch. I am far more hyped over Alder Lake, the 12th generation from Intel that is due later this year in 2021. It will be on an all-new socket, LGA 1700, and it'll be Intel's first mainstream 16-core CPU. It will also be the first with big little cores, having 8 very high-powered hyper-threaded cores and 8 lower-powered non-hyper-threaded cores. So it will be an interesting time testing that one. 16 cores and 24 threads is an odd number, so we'll have to see how that turns out. If you really need something to tide you over until that arrives, get the i5-11400 for under $200. Put it on a cheaper motherboard and use it for the next 9 to 12 months until Alder Lake arrives. That will also bring PCI Express 5.0, DDR5, USB 4, and a number of other new technologies which will make all the current CPUs seem old overnight. YouTube Premium is, to put it simply, awesome. We have been paying customers since the day it launched as YouTube Red a few years ago, and we haven't seen an ad on YouTube since. We get it, no one actually likes ads, but we also love to watch our favorite content. However, it's not reasonable to directly support every creator either. Enter YouTube Premium, the one-stop shop for supporting everyone with a single low monthly payment. The way it works is pretty simple. You sign up and the majority of your monthly payment goes to the creators that you personally watch divided by your watch time. Watch one creator more than another, they get a larger cut. But the benefits don't stop there. You can listen to the audio of videos on mobile devices while having the screen blanked out. You can also download videos for offline viewing, and you get a YouTube Music Premium subscription to allow for interruption-free music listening. Now, the price varies by country, but it starts at $11.99 a month in the United States, and there's also a family plan for $8 a month more that allows for 6 people to share a single membership in your household. If you're outside the US, check your local price using our link in the video description below. Thank you all so much for watching to the very end of this video. An extra bonus gold star just for you very special people. Like this video if you like it. Share it with your friends if you love it. Remember to subscribe to the channel with the big huge red button directly below. Hit the bell notification icon to actually be notified when new videos come out. Smash that join button to provide direct support for the channel. It is greatly appreciated. Join the Tech Deals Discord, linked in the video description below, and come join our community with 18 private chat channels and a wonderful collection of people talking tech, among other things. Leave your comments in the comment section below. I'm sure this one will elicit at least 1 or 2 comments. I am looking forward to reading all of them. I will respond to at least some of them, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. Links to these products to Amazon and Newegg will be down in the video description below. If you love this video, use those links when shopping. It supports the channel at no extra cost to you and is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I will see all of you next time.